Johnny Ludlow, first series by Mrs. Henry Wood. Johnny Ludlow, first series, 1874, consists of 26 short, self-contained stories. Each chapter explores different events, mysteries, and social issues, with Johnny Ludlow either observing or participating. You can enjoy each story individually, making this series perfect for watching one chapter at a time. Part 4. Chapter 7. Aunt Dean. Timberdale was a small place on the other side of Crab Ravine. Its rector was the Reverend Jacob Lewis. Timberdale called him Parson Lewis when not on ceremony. He had married a widow, Mrs. Tannerton. She had a good deal of money and 2 boys, and the parish thought the new lady might be above them. But she proved kind and good, and her boys did not ride roughshod over the land or break down the farmers' fences. She died in 3 or 4 years after a long illness. Timberdale talked about her will, deeming it a foolish one. She left all she possessed to the rector, in affectionate confidence, as the will worded it, knowing he would do what was right and just by her sons. As Parson Lewis was an upright man with a conscience of his own, it was supposed he would do so, but Timberdale considered that for the boy's sake, she should have made it sure herself. It was $800 a year, good measure. Parson Lewis had a sister, Mrs. Dean, a widow also, who lived near Liverpool. She was not left well off at all, could but just make a living of it. She used to come on long visits to the parsonage, which saved her cupboard at home. But it was said that Mrs. Lewis did not like her, thinking her deceitful, and they did not get on very well together. Parson Lewis, the meekest man in the world and the most easily led, admitted to his wife that Rebecca had always been a little given to scheming, but he thought her true at heart. When poor Mrs. Lewis was out of the way for good in Timberdale churchyard, Aunt Dean had the field to herself, and came and stayed as long as she pleased, with her child Alice. She was a little woman with a mild face and fair skin, and had a sort of purring manner with her, scarcely speaking above her breath, and saying dear and love at every sentence, and caressing people to their faces. The rule was to fall in love with her at once. The boys, Herbert and Jack, had taken to her without question from the first, and called her aunt, though she was of course no relation whatever to them. Both the boys made much of Alice, a bright-eyed, pretty little girl with brown curls and timid, winsome ways. Herbert, who was very studious himself, helped her with her lessons. Jack, who was nearer her age, but a few months older, took her out on expeditions, haymaking and blackberrying and the like, and would bring her home with her frock torn and her knees damaged. He told her that brave little girls never cried with him, and the child would ignore the smart of the grazed knees and show herself as brave as a martyr. Jack was so brave and fearless himself, and made so little of hurts, that she felt a sort of shame at giving way to her natural timidity when with him. What Alice liked best was to sit indoors by Herbert's side while he was at his lessons, and read storybooks and fairy tales. Jack was the opposite of all that, and a regular renegade in all kinds of study. He would have liked to pitch the books into the fire, and did not even care for fairy tales. They came often enough to Crab Cot when we were there, and to our neighbors the Connies, with whom the parsonage was intimate. I was only a little fellow at the time, years younger than they were, but I remember I liked Jack better than Herbert, as Todd did also for the matter of that. Herbert was too clever for us, and he was to be a parson besides. He chose the calling himself. More than once he was caught muffled in the parson's white surplice, preaching to Jack and Alice a sermon of his own composition. Aunt Dean had her plans and her plots. One great plot was always at work. She made it into a dream, and peeped into it night and day, as if it were a kaleidoscope of rich and many colors. Herbert Tannerton was to marry her daughter and succeed to his mother's property as eldest son. Jack must go adrift and earn his own living. She considered it was already 3 parts as good as accomplished. To see Herbert and Alice poring over books together side by side, and to know that they had the same tastes, was welcome to her as the sight of gold. As to Jack, with his roving propensities, his climbing and his daring, she thought it little matter if he came down a tree head foremost some day, or pitched head over heels into the depths of Crab Ravine, and so threw his life away. Not that she really wished any cruel fate for the boy, but she did not care for him, and he might be terribly in the way when her foolish brother, the parson, came to apportion the money. And he was foolish in some things, soft in fact. She often said so. One summer day, when the fruit was ripe and the sun shining, Mr. Lewis had gone into his study to write his next Sunday's sermon. He did not get on very quickly, for Aunt Dean was in there also, and it disturbed him a little. She was of restless habits, everlastingly dusting books, and putting things in their places without rhyme or reason. "Do you wish to keep out all 3 of these inkstands, Jacob? It is not necessary, I should think. Shall I put one up?" The parson took his eyes off his sermon to answer. "I don't see that they do any harm there, Rebecca. The children use 2 sometimes. Do as you like, however." Mrs. Dean put one of the inkstands into the bookcase, and then looked round the room to see what else she could do. A letter caught her eye. "Jacob, I do believe you have never answered the note old Mullet brought this morning. There it is on the mantelpiece." The parson sighed. To be interrupted in this way, he took quite as a matter of course, but it teased him a little. "I must see the churchwardens, Rebecca, before answering it. I want to know, you see, what would be approved of by the parish." "Just like you, Jacob," she caressingly said. "The parish must approve of what you approve." "Yes, yes," he said hastily, "but I like to live at peace with every one." He dipped his pen into the ink and wrote a line of his sermon. The open window looked on to the kitchen garden. Herbert Tannerton had his back against the walnut tree, doing nothing. Alice sat near on a stool, her head buried in a book that by its canvas cover Mrs. Dean knew to be Robinson Crusoe. Just then Jack came out of the raspberry bushes with a handful of fruit, which he held out to Alice. Robinson Crusoe fell to the ground. "Oh, Jack, how good they are," said Alice. And the words came distinctly to Aunt Dean's ears in the still day. "They are as good again when you pick them off the trees for yourself," cried Jack. "Come along and get some, Alice." With the taste of the raspberries in her mouth, the temptation was not to be resisted, and she ran after Jack. Aunt Dean put her head out at the window. "Alice, my love, I cannot have you go amongst those raspberry bushes. You would stain and tear your frock." "I'll take care of her frock, Aunt," Jack called back. "My darling Jack, it cannot be. That is her new muslin frock, and she must not go where she might injure it." So Alice sat down again to Robinson Crusoe, and Jack went his way amongst the raspberry bushes, or whither he would. "Jacob, have you begun to think of what John is to be?" resumed Aunt Dean, as she shut down the window. The parson pushed his sermon from him in a sort of patient hopelessness, and turned round on his chair. "To be? In what way, Rebecca?" "By profession," she answered. "I fancy it is time it was thought of." "Do you?" "I'm sure I don't know. The other day when something was being mentioned about it, Jack said he did not care what he was to be, provided he had no books to trouble him." "I only hope you will not have trouble with him, Jacob dear," observed Mrs. Dean in ominous tones that plainly intimated she thought the parson would. "He has a good heart, though he is not so studious as his brother." "Why have you shut the window, Rebecca?" "It is very warm." Mrs. Dean did not say why. Perhaps she wished to guard against the conversation being heard. When any question not quite convenient to answer was put to her, she had a way of passing it over in silence, and the parson was too yielding or too inert to ask again. "Of course, brother Jacob, you will make Herbert the heir." The parson looked surprised. "Why should you suppose that, Rebecca? I think the 2 boys ought to share and share alike." "My dear Jacob, how can you think so? Your dead wife left you in charge, remember." "That's what I do remember, Rebecca. She never gave me the slightest hint that she should wish any difference to be made. She was as fond of one boy as of the other." "Jacob, you must do your duty by the boys," returned Mrs. Dean with affectionate solemnity. "Herbert must be his mother's heir. It is right and proper it should be so. Jack must be trained to earn his own livelihood. Jack, dear fellow, is, I fear, of a roving, random disposition. Were you to leave any portion of the money to him, he would squander it in a year. Dear me, I hope not. But as to leaving all to his brother, or even a larger portion than to Jack, I don't know that it would be right. A heavy responsibility lies on me in this charge. Don't you see, Rebecca? No doubt it does. It is full 800 a year, and you must be putting something by, Jacob. Not much. I draw the money yearly, but expenses seem to swallow it up. What with the ponies kept for the boys, and the cost of the masters from Worcester, and 100 a year out of it that my wife desired the poor old nurse should have till she died, there's not a great deal left. My living is a poor one, you know, and I like to help the poor freely. When the boys go to the university, it will be all wanted. Help the poor freely, just like him, thought Aunt Dean. It would be waste of time and money to send Jack to college. You should try and get him some appointment abroad, Jacob. In India, say. The clergyman opened his eyes at this and said he should not like to see Jack go out of his own country. Jack's mother had not had any opinion of foreign places. Jack himself interrupted the conversation. He came flying up the path, put down a cabbage leaf full of raspberries on the windowsill, and flung open the window with his stained fingers. Aunt Dean, I've picked these for you, he said, introducing the leaf, his handsome face and good-natured eyes bright and sparkling. They've never been so good as they are this year. Father, just taste them. Aunt Dean smiled sweetly and called him her darling, and Mr. Lewis tasted the raspberries. We were just talking of you, Jack, cried the unsophisticated man, and Mrs. Dean slightly knitted her brows. Your aunt says it is time you began to think of some profession. What? Yet a while, returned Jack. That you may be suitably educated for it, my boy. I should like to be something that won't want education, cried Jack, leaning his arms on the windowsill and jumping up and down. I think I'd rather be a farmer than anything, father. The parson drew a long face. This had never entered into his calculations. I fear that would not do, Jack. I should like you to choose something higher than that, some profession by which you may rise in the world. Herbert will go into the church. What should you say to the bar? Jack's jumping ceased all at once. What? Be a barrister, father? Like those bewigged fellows that come on circuit twice a year to Worcester. Like that, Jack? But they have to study all their lives for it, father, and read up millions of books before they can pass. I couldn't do it. I couldn't indeed. What do you think of being a first-class lawyer? Then, I might place you with some good firm, such as— Don't! There's a dear father, interrupted Jack, all the sunshine leaving his face. I'm afraid if I were at a desk, I should kick it over without knowing it. I must be running out and about. Are they all gone, Aunt Dean? Give me the leaf, and I'll pick you some more. The years went on. Jack was 15, Herbert 18, and at Oxford. The advanced scholar had gone to college early. Aunt Dean spent quite half her time at Timberdale, from Easter till autumn, and the parson never rose up against it. She let her house during her absence. It was situated on the banks of the river a little way from Liverpool, near the place they call New Brighton now. It might have been called New Brighton then for all I know. One family always took the house for the summer months, glad to get out of hot Liverpool. As to Jack, nothing had been decided in regard to his future, for opinions about it differed. A little Latin and a little history and a great deal of geography, for he liked that, had been drilled into him, and there his education ended. But he was the best climber and walker and leaper, and withal the best-hearted young fellow that Timberdale could boast. And he knew about land thoroughly, and possessed a great stock of general and useful and practical information. Many a day when some of the poorer farmers were in a desperate hurry to get in their hay or carry their wheat on account of threatening weather, had Jack Tannerton turned out to help, and toiled as hard and as long as any of the laborers. He was hail fellow well met with everyone, rich and poor. Mrs. Dean had worked on always to accomplish her ends. Slowly and imperceptibly, but surely, Herbert must be the heir. John must shift for himself. The parson had had this dinned into him so often now, in her apparently frank and reasoning way, that he began to lend an ear to it. What with his strict sense of justice and his habit of yielding to his sister's views, he felt for the most part in a kind of dilemma. But Mrs. Dean had come over this time, determined to get something settled, one way or the other. She arrived before Easter this year. The interminable Jack, as she often called him in her heart, was at home. Herbert was not. Jack and Alice did not seem to miss him, but went out on their rambles together, as they did when children. The morning before Herbert was expected, a letter came from him to his stepfather, saying he had been invited by a fellow student to spend the Easter holidays at his home near London, and had accepted it. Mr. Lewis took it as a matter of course in his easy way, but it disagreed with Aunt Dean. She said all manner of things to the parson, and incited him to write for Herbert to return at once. Herbert's answer to this was a courteous intimation that he could not alter his plans, and he hoped his father, on consideration, would fail to see any good reason why he should do so. Herbert Tannerton had a will of his own. Neither do I see any reason, good or bad, why he should not pay the visit, Rebecca, confessed the rector. I'm afraid it was foolish of me to object at all. Perhaps I have not the right to deny him, either, if I wished it. He is getting on for 19, and I am not his own father. So Aunt Dean had to make the best and the worst of it, but she felt as cross as two sticks. One day when the parson was abroad on parish matters, and the rectory empty, she went out for a stroll and reached the high steep bank where the primroses and violets grew. Looking over, she saw Jack and Alice seated below, Jack's arm round her waist. You were to be my wife, you know, Alice, when we were grown up. Mind that? There was no answer, but Aunt Dean certainly thought she heard the sound of a kiss. Peeping over again, she saw Jack taking another. And if you don't object to my being a farmer, Alice, I should like it best of all. We'll keep 2 jolly ponies and ride about together. Won't it be good? I don't object to farming, Jack. Anything you like. A successful farmer's home is a very pleasant one. Aunt Dean drew away with noiseless steps. She was too calm and callous a woman to turn white, but she did turn angry and registered a vow in her heart. That presuming, upstart Jack. They were only 2 little fools, it's true, no better than children, but the nonsense must be stopped in time. Herbert went back to Oxford without coming home. Alice, to her own infinite astonishment, was dispatched to school until midsummer. The parson and his sister and Jack were left alone, and Aunt Dean, with her soft, smooth manner and her false expressions of endearment, ruled all things, her brother's better nature amidst the rest. Jack was asked what he would be. A farmer, he answered. But Aunt Dean had somehow caught up the most bitter notions possible against farming in general, and Mr. Lewis, not much liking the thing himself, and yielding to the undercurrent ever gently flowing, told Jack he must fix on something else. There's nothing I shall do so well at as farming, father, remonstrated Jack. You could put me for 3 or 4 years to some good agriculturist, and I'll be bound at the end of the time I should be fit to manage the largest and best farm in the country. Why, I am a better farmer now than some of them are. Jack, my boy, you must not be self-willed. I cannot let you be a farmer. Then send me to sea, father, and make a sailor of me, returned Jack with undisturbed good humor. But this startled the parson. He liked Jack, and he had a horror of the sea. Not that, Jack, my boy. Anything but that. I'm not sure, but I should like the sea better than farming, went on Jack, the idea full in his head. Aunt Dean lent me Peter Simple one day. I know I should make a first-rate sailor. Jack, don't talk so. Your poor mother would not have liked it, and I don't like it, and I shall never let you go. Some fellows run away to sea, said Jack, laughing. The parson felt as though a bucket of cold water had been thrown down his back. Did Jack mean that as a threat? John, said he, in as solemn a way as he had ever spoken, disobedience to parents sometimes brings a curse with it. You must promise me that you will never go to sea. I'll not promise that offhand, said Jack, but I will promise never to go without your consent. Think it well over, father. There's no hurry. It was on the tip of Mr. Lewis's tongue to withdraw his objection to the farming scheme then and there. In comparison with the other, it looked quite fair and bright. But he thought he might compromise his judgment to yield thus instantly. And, as Easy Jack said, there was no hurry. So Jack went rushing out of doors again to the uttermost bounds of the parish, and the parson was left to Aunt Dean. When he told her he meant to let Jack be a farmer, she laughed till the tears came in her eyes and begged him to leave matters to her. She knew how to manage boys without appearing directly to cross them. There was this kind of trouble with most boys, she had observed, before they settled satisfactorily in life, but it all came right in the end. So the parson said no more about farming, but Jack talked a great deal about the sea. Mr. Lewis went over in his gig to Worcester and bought a book he had heard of 2 years before the mast. He wrote Jack's name in it and gave it him, hoping its contents might serve to sicken him of the sea. The next morning the book was missing. Jack looked high and low for it, but it was gone. He had left it on the sitting room table when he went up to bed, and it mysteriously disappeared during the night. The servants had not seen it, and declared it was not on the table in the morning. "It could not, I suppose, have been the cat," observed Aunt Dean in a doubtful manner, her eyes full of wonder as to where the book could have got to. "I have heard of cats doing strange things. I don't think the cat would make away with a book of that size, Rebecca," said the parson. And if he had not been the least suspicious parson in all the Worcester diocese, he might have asked his sister whether she had been the cat, and secured the book lest it should dissipate Jack's fancy for the sea. The next thing she did was to carry Jack off to Liverpool. The parson objected at first. Liverpool was a seaport town, and might put Jack more in mind of the sea than ever. Aunt Dean replied that she meant him to see the worst sides of sea life, the dirty boats in the Mersey, the wretchedness of the crews, and the real discomfort and misery of a sailor's existence. That would cure him, she said. What he had in his head now was the romance picked up from books. The parson thought there was reason in this, and yielded. He was dreadfully anxious about Jack. She went straight to her house near New Brighton, Jack with her, and a substantial sum in her pocket from the rector to pay for Jack's keep. The old servant, Peggy, who took care of it, was thunderstruck to see her mistress come in. It was not yet occupied by the Liverpool people, and Mrs. Dean sent them word they could not have it this year, at least not for the present. While she put matters straight, she supplied Jack with all Captain Marryat's novels to read. The house looked on the river, and Jack would watch the fine vessels starting on their long voyages, their white sails trim and fair in the sunshine, or hear the joyous shouts from the sailors of a homeward-bound ship as Liverpool hove in view. And he grew to think there was no sight so pleasant to the eye as these wonderful ships, no fate so desirable as to sail in them. But Aunt Dean had changed her tactics. Instead of sending Jack onto the dirtiest and worst managed boats in the docks, where the living was hard and the sailors were discontented, she allowed him to roam at will on the finest ships and make acquaintance with their enthusiastic young officers, especially with those who were going to sea for the first time with just such notions as Jack's. Before midsummer came, Jack Tannerton had grown to think that he could never be happy on land. There was a new ship just launched, the Rose of Delhi, a magnificent vessel. Jack took rare interest in her. He was forever on board, was forever saying to her owners, friends of Aunt Dean's, to whom she had introduced him, how much he should like to sail in her. The owners thought it would be an advantageous thing to get so active, open, and ready a lad into their service, although he was somewhat old for entering, and they offered to article him for 4 years as midshipman on the Rose of Delhi. Jack went home with his tale, his eyes glowing, and Aunt Dean neither checked him nor helped him. Not then. Later, when the ship was all but ready to sail, she told Jack she'd wash her hands of it, and recommended him to write and ask his stepfather whether he might sail in her or not. Now Jack was no letter writer. Neither, truth to tell, was the parson. He had not once written home, but had contented himself with sending affectionate messages in Aunt Dean's letters. Consequently, Mr. Lewis only knew what Aunt Dean had chosen to tell him, and had no idea that Jack was getting the real sea fever upon him. But at her suggestion, Jack sat down now and wrote a long letter. Its purport was this, that he was longing and hoping to go to sea, was sure he should never like anything else in the world so well, that the Rose of Delhi, Captain Druce, was the most magnificent ship ever launched, that the owners bore the best character in Liverpool for liberality, and Captain Druce for kindness to his middies, and that he hoped his father would let him go, but that if he still refused, he, Jack, would do his best to be content to stay on shore, for he did not forget his promise of never sailing without his consent. "Would you like to see the letter, Aunt Dean, before I close it?" he asked. Aunt Dean, who had been sitting by, took the letter, and privately thought it was as good a letter and as much to the purpose as the best scribe in the land could have written. She disliked it for all that. "Jack, dear, I think you had better put a postscript," she said. "Your father detests writing, as you know. Tell him that if he consents, he need not write any answer. You will know what it means, that you may go, and it will save him trouble. But, Aunt Dean, I should like him to wish me goodbye and Godspeed. He will be sure to do the one in his heart, and the other in his prayers, my boy. Write your postscript. Jack did as he was bid. He was as docile as his stepfather. Exactly as Mrs. Dean suggested, wrote he. And he added that if no answer arrived within 2 posts, he should take it for granted that he was to go and should see about his outfit. There was no time to lose, for the ship would sail in 3 or 4 days. "I will post it for you, Jack," she said when it was ready. "I'm going out." "Thank you, Aunt Dean, but I can post it myself." "I'd rather. And then I shall know it's off." "Oh, shan't I be on thorns till the time for an answer comes and goes?" He snatched his cap and vaulted off with the letter before he could be stopped. Aunt Dean had a curious look on her face and sat biting her lips. She had not intended the letter to go. The first post that could possibly bring an answer brought one. Jack was not at home. Aunt Dean had sent him out on an early commission, watched for the postman, and hastened to the door herself to receive what he might bring. He brought 2 letters as it chanced, one from the rector of Timberdale, one from Alice Dean. Mrs. Dean locked up the one in her private drawer upstairs. The other she left on the breakfast table. "Peggy says the postman has been here." "Aunt!" cried the boy, all excitement, as he ran in. "Yes, dear. He brought a letter from Alice, and nothing from Timberdale." "Well, I don't know that you could quite expect it by this post, Jack. Your father might like to take a little time for consideration. You may read Alice's letter, my boy. She comes home this day week for the summer holidays." "Not till this day week," cried Jack, frightfully disappointed. "Why, I shall have sailed then, if I go. Aunt Dean, I shall not see her." "Well, dear, you will see her when you come home again." Aunt Dean had no more commissions for Jack after that, and each time the postman was expected, he placed himself outside the door to wait for him. The man brought no other letter. The reasonable time for an answer went by, and none came. "Aunt Dean, I suppose I may get my outfit now," said Jack, only half satisfied. "But I wish I had told him to write in any case. Just a line. According to what you said, you know, Jack, silence must be taken for consent." "Yes, I know. I'd rather have had a word, though, and made certain. I wish there was time for me just to run over to Timberdale and see him. But there's not, Jack. More's the pity. You would lose the ship. Get a piece of paper and make out a list of the articles the second mate told you would want." The Rose of Delhi sailed out of port for Calcutta, and John Tannerton with her, having signed articles to serve in her for 4 years. The night before his departure, he wrote a short letter of farewell to his stepfather, thanking him for his tacit consent, and promising to do his best to get on, concluding it with love to himself and to Herbert, and to the rectory servants. Which letter somehow got put into Aunt Dean's kitchen fire, and never reached Timberdale. Aunt Dean watched the Rose of Delhi sail by, Jack, in his brand-new uniform, waving his last farewell to her with his gold-banded cap. The sigh of relief she heaved when the fine vessel was out of sight seemed to do her good. Then she bolted herself into her chamber and opened Mr. Lewis's letter, which had lain untouched till then. As she expected, it contained a positive interdiction, written half sternly, half lovingly, for John to sail in the Rose of Delhi, or to think more of the sea. Moreover, it commanded him to come home at once, and it contained a promise that he should be placed to learn the farming without delay. Aunt Dean tripped down to Peggy's fire and burnt that too. There was a dreadful fuss when Jack's departure became known at Timberdale. It fell upon the parson like a thunderbolt. He came striding through the ravine to Crab Cot, and actually burst out crying while telling the news to the squire. He feared he had failed somehow in bringing John up, he said, or he never would have repaid him with this base disobedience and ingratitude. For you see, the poor man thought Jack had received his letter and gone off in defiance of it. The squire agreed with him that Jack deserved the cat o' nine tails, as did all other boys who traitorously decamped to sea. Before the hay was all in, Aunt Dean was back at Timberdale, bringing Alice with her and the bills for the outfit. She let the parson think what he would about Jack, ignoring all knowledge of the letter, and affecting to believe that Jack could not have had it. But the parson argued that Jack must have had it, and did have it, or it would have come back to him. The only one to say a good word for Jack was Alice. She persisted in an opinion that Jack could not be either disobedient or ungrateful, and that there must have been some strange mistake somewhere. Aunt Dean's work was not all done. She took the poor parson under her wing, and proved to him that he had no resource now but to disinherit Jack and made Herbert the heir. To leave money to Jack would be wanton waste, she urged, for he would be sure to squander it. Better bequeath all to Herbert, who would of course look after his brother in later life, and help him if he needed help. So Mr. Hill, one of the Worcester solicitors, was sent for to Timberdale to receive instructions for making the parson's will in Herbert's favor, and to cut Jack off with a shilling. That night, after Mr. Hill had gone back again, was one of the worst the parson had ever spent. He was a just man and a kind one, and he felt racked with fear lest he had taken too severe a measure, and one that his late wife, the true owner of the money and John's mother, would never have sanctioned. His bed was fevered, his pillow a torment. Up he got, and walked the room in his nightshirt. "My Lord and God knoweth that I would do what is right," he groaned. "I am sorely troubled. Youth is vain and desperately thoughtless." Perhaps the boy, in his love of adventure, never looked at the step in the light of ingratitude. "I cannot cut him quite off. I should never again find peace of mind if I did it. He shall have a little, and perhaps if he grows into a steady fellow and comes back what he ought to be, I may alter the will later and leave them equal inheritors." The next day, the parson wrote privately to Mr. Hill, saying he had reconsidered his determination and would let Jack inherit to the extent of £150 a year. Herbert came home for the long vacation, and he and Alice were together as they had been before that upstart Jack stepped in. They often came to the Squire's and oftener to the Coney's. Grace Coney, a niece of old Coney, had come to live at the farm. She was a nice girl, and she and Alice liked each other. You might see them with Herbert strolling about the fields any hour in the day. At home, Alice and Herbert seemed never to care to separate. Mrs. Dean watched them quietly and thought how beautifully her plans had worked. Aunt Dean did not go home till October. After she left, the parson had a stroke of paralysis. Charles Ashton, then just ordained to priest's orders, took the duty. Mrs. Dean came back again for Christmas. As if she would let Alice stay away from the parsonage when Herbert was at home, the Rose of Delhi did not come back for nearly 2 years. She was what is called a free ship and took charters for any place she could make money by. One day Alice Dean was leaning out of the windows of her mother's house, gazing wistfully on the sparkling sea, when a grand and stately vessel came sailing homewards, and some brown-faced young fellow on the quarter-deck set on to swing his cap violently by way of hailing her. She looked to the flag which happened to be flying, and read the name there, the Rose of Delhi. It must be Jack who was saluting. Alice burst into tears of emotion. He came up from the docks the same day, a great brown, handsome fellow with the old single-hearted, open manners, and he clasped Alice in his arms and kissed her ever so many times before she could get free. Being a grown-up young lady now, she did not approve of unceremonious kissing, and told Jack so. Aunt Dean was not present, or she might have told him so more to the purpose. Jack had given satisfaction, and was getting on. He told Alice privately that he did not like the sea so much as he anticipated, and could not believe how any other fellow did like it. But as he had chosen it as his calling, he meant to stand by it. He went to Timberdale, in spite of Aunt Dean's advice and efforts to keep him away. Herbert was absent, she said, the rector ill and childish. Jack found it all too true. Mr. Lewis's mind had failed, and his health was breaking. He knew Jack and was very affectionate with him, but seemed not to remember anything of the past. So never a word did Jack hear of his own disobedience, or of any missing letters. One person alone questioned him, and that was Alice. It was after he got back from Timberdale. She asked him to tell her the history of his sailing in the Rose of Delhi, and he gave it in detail, without reserve. When he spoke of the postscript that Aunt Dean had bade him add to his letter, arranging that silence should be taken for consent, and that as no answer had come, he of course had so taken it, the girl turned sick and faint. She saw the treachery that had been at work and where it had lain. But for her mother's sake, she hushed it up and let the matter pass. Alice had not lived with her mother so many years without detecting her propensity for deceit. Some years passed by. Jack got on well. He served as third mate on the Rose of Delhi long before he could pass, by law, for second. He was made second mate as soon as he had passed for it. The Rose of Delhi came in and went out, and Jack stayed by her, and passed for first mate in course of time. He was not sent back in any of his examinations, as most young sailors are, and the board once went the length of complimenting him on his answers. The fact was, Jack held to his word of doing his best. He got into no mischief and was the smartest sailor afloat. He was in consequence a favorite with the owners, and Captain Druce took pains with him and brought him on in seamanship and navigation, and showed him how to take observations, and all the rest of it. There's no end of difference in merchant captains in this respect. Some teach their junior officers nothing. Jack finally passed triumphantly for master, and hoped his time would come to receive a command. Meanwhile, he went out again as first mate on the Rose of Delhi. One spring morning there came news to Mrs. Dean from Timberdale. The rector had had another stroke and was thought to be near his end. She started off at once with Alice. Charles Ashton had had a living given to him, and Herbert Tannerton was now his stepfather's curate. Herbert had passed as shiningly in mods and divinity and all the rest of it as Jack had passed before the Marine Board. He was a steady, thoughtful, serious young man, did his duty well in the parish, and preached better sermons than ever the rector had. Mrs. Dean, who looked upon him as Alice's husband as surely as though they were married, was as proud of his success as though it had been her own. The rector was very ill and unable to leave his bed. His intellect was quite gone now. Mrs. Dean sat with him most of the day, leaving Alice to be taken care of by Herbert. They went about together just as always, and were on the best of confidential terms, and came over to the Connies, and to us when we were at Crabcott. Herbert, said Mrs. Dean one evening when she had all her soft, sugary manner upon her, and was making the young parson believe she had no one's interest at heart in the world but his. My darling boy, is it not almost time you began to think of marriage? None know the happiness and comfort brought by a good wife, dear, until they experience it. Herbert looked taken aback. He turned as red as a schoolgirl and glanced half a moment at Alice, like a detected thief. I must wait until I have a living to think of that, Aunt Dean. Is it necessary, Herbert? I should have thought you might bring a wife home to the rectory here. Herbert turned the subject with a jesting word or two and got out of his redness. Aunt Dean was eminently satisfied. His confusion and his hasty glance at Alice had told tales, and she knew it was only a question of time. The rector died. When the grass was long and the mayflowers were in bloom and the cuckoo was singing in the trees, he passed peacefully to his rest. Just before death, he recovered speech and consciousness. But the chief thing he said was that he left his love to Jack. After the funeral, the will was opened. It had not been touched since that long past year when Jack had gone away to sea. Out of the 800 a year descended from their mother, Jack had 150, Herbert the rest. Aunt Dean made a hideous frown for once in her life. 150 pounds a year for Jack was only, as she looked upon it, so much robbery on Herbert and Alice. Out of the little money saved by the rector, 500 pounds were left to his sister, Rebecca Dean. The rest was to be divided equally between Herbert and Jack, and his furniture and effects went to Herbert. On the whole, Aunt Dean was tolerably satisfied. She was a woman who liked strictly to keep up appearances, and she made a move to leave the young parson at the end of a week or two's time and go back to Liverpool. Herbert did not detain her. His own course was uncertain until a fresh rector should be appointed. The living was in the gift of a neighboring baronet, and it was fancied by some that he might give it to Herbert. One thing did surprise Mrs. Dean, angered her too, that Herbert had not made his offer to Alice before their departure. Now that he had his own fortune at command, there was no necessity to wait for a living. News greeted them on their arrival. The Rose of Delhi was on her way home once more, with John Tannerton in command. Captain Druce had been left behind at Calcutta, dangerously ill. Alice's color came and went. She looked out for the homeward-bound vessels passing upwards, and felt quite sick with anxiety lest Jack should fail in any way and never bring home the ship at all. The Rose of Delhi, Captain Tannerton. Alice Dean cast her eyes on the shipping news in the morning paper and read the announcement amidst the arrivals. Just for an instant her sight left her. "Mamma," she presently said, quietly passing over the newspaper, "the Rose of Delhi is in." "The Rose of Delhi, Captain Tannerton," read Mrs. Dean. The idea of their sticking in Jack's name as captain. "He will have to go down again as soon as Captain Druce returns." A fine captain, I dare say, he has made. At least he has brought the ship home safely and quickly, Alice ventured to say. It must have passed after dark last night. Why after dark? Alice did not reply, because I was watching till daylight faded, which would have been the truth. Had it passed before, some of us might have seen it, Mama. The day was waning before Jack came up. Captain Tannerton. Jack was never to go back again to his chief mateship, as Aunt Dean had surmised, for the owners had given him permanent command of the Rose of Delhi. The last mail had brought news from Captain Druce that he should never be well enough for the command again, and the owners were only too glad to give it to the younger and more active man. Officers and crew alike reported that never a better master sail than Jack had proved himself on this homeward voyage. Don't you think I have been very lucky on the whole, Aunt Dean? Fancy a young fellow like me getting such a beautiful ship as that. Oh, very lucky, returned Aunt Dean. Jack looked like a captain, too. He was broad and manly, with an intelligent, honest, handsome face, and the quick, keen eye of a sailor. Jack was particular in his attire, too, and some sailors are not so. He dressed as a gentleman when on shore. Only 150 left to me, cried Jack when he was told the news. Well, perhaps Herbert may require more than I. Poor fellow, he added in his good nature. He may not get a good living, and then he'll be glad of it. I shall be sure to do well now I've got the ship. You'll be at sea always, Jack, and we'll have no use for money, said Mrs. Dean. Oh, I don't know about having no use for it, Aunt. Anyway, my father thought it right to leave it so, and I am content. I wish I could have said farewell to him before he died. A few more days, and Aunt Dean was thrown on her beam ends at a worse angle than ever the Rose of Delhi hoped to be. Jack and Alice discussed matters between themselves, and the result was disclosed to her. They were going to be married. It was Alice who told her. Jack had just left, and she and her mother were sitting together in the summer twilight. At first, Mrs. Dean thought Alice was joking. She was like a madwoman when she found it true. Her great dream had never foreshadowed this. How dare you attempt to think of so monstrous a thing, you wicked girl? Marry your own brother-in-law. It would be no better. It is Herbert that is to be your husband. Alice shook her head with a smile. Herbert would not have me, Mama. Nor would I have him. Herbert will marry Grace Coney. Who? Cried Mrs. Dean. Grace Coney. They have been in love with each other ever so many years. I have known it all along. He will marry her as soon as his future is settled. I had promised to be one of the bridesmaids, but I suppose I shall not have the chance now. Grace Coney, that beggarly girl, shrieked Mrs. Dean. But for her uncle's giving her shelter, she must have turned out in the world when her father died and earned her living how she could. She is not a lady. She is not Herbert's equal. Oh yes, she is, Mama. She is a very nice girl and will make him a perfect wife. Herbert would not exchange her for the richest lady in the land. If Herbert chooses to make a spectacle of himself, you never shall, cried poor Mrs. Dean, all her golden visions fast melting into air. I would see that wicked Jack Tannerton at the bottom of the sea first. Mother dear, listen to me. Jack and I have cared for each other for years and years, and we should neither of us marry anyone else. There is nothing to wait for. Jack is as well off as he will be for years to come. And we have settled it so, and I hope you will not oppose it. It was a cruel moment for Aunt Dean. Her love for other people had been all pretense, but she did love her daughter. Besides that, she was ambitious for her. I can never let you marry a sailor, Alice. Anything but that. It was you who made Jack a sailor, Mother, and there's no help for it, said Alice in low tones. I would rather he had been anything else in the world. I should have liked him to have had land and farmed it. We should have done well. Jack had his 400 a year clear, you know. At least he ought to have had it. Oh, Mother, don't you see that while you have been plotting against Jack, you have plotted against me? Aunt Dean felt sick with memories that were crowding upon her. The mistake she had made was a frightful one. You cannot join your fate to Jack's, Alice, she repeated, wringing her hands. A sailor's wife is too liable to be made a widow. I know it, Mother. I shall share his danger, for I am going out in the Rose of Delhi. The owners have consented, and Jack is fitting up a lovely little cabin for me that is to be my own saloon. My daughter sail over the seas in a merchant ship, gasped Aunt Dean. Never. I should be no true wife if I could let my husband sail without me. Mother, it is you alone who have carved out our destiny. Better have left it to God." In a startled way, her heart full of remorse, she was beginning to see it, and she sat down, half fainting, on a chair. "It is a miserable prospect, Alice. Mother, we shall get on. There's the 150 a year certain, you know, that we shall put by, and as long as I sail with him, a good deal more besides. Jack's pay is settled at £20 a month, and he will make more by commission, perhaps as much again. Have no fear for us on that score. Jack has been unjustly deprived of his birthright, and I think sometimes that perhaps as a recompense heaven will prosper him. But the danger, Alice, the danger of a sea life. Do you know what Jack says about the danger, Mother? He says God is over us on the sea as well as on land, and will take care of those who put their trust in him. In the wildest storm, I will try to let that great truth help me to feel peace." Alas for Aunt Dean! Arguments slipped away from her hands just as her plans had slipped from them. In her bitter repentance, she lay on the floor of her room that night and asked God to have pity upon her, for her troubles seemed greater than she could bear. The morning's post brought news from Herbert. He was made rector of Timberdale. Aunt Dean wrote back, telling him what had taken place, and asking, nay, almost commanding, that he should restore an equal share of the property to Jack. Herbert replied that he should abide by his stepfather's will. The living of Timberdale was not a rich one, and he wished Grace, his future wife, to be comfortable. Herbert was always intensely selfish, groaned Aunt Dean. Look on which side she would, there was no comfort. The Rose of Delhi, Captain Tannerton, sailed out of port again, carrying also with her Mrs. Tannerton, the captain's wife. And Aunt Dean was left to bemoan her fate, and wish she had never tried to shape out other people's destinies. Better, as Alice said, that she had left that to God. Chapter 8. Going through the tunnel. We had to make a rush for it, and making a rush did not suit the squire, any more than it does other people who have come to an age when the body's heavy and the breath nowhere. He reached the train, pushed head foremost into a carriage, and then remembered the tickets. "Bless my heart," he exclaimed as he jumped out again, and nearly upset a lady who had a little dog in her arms and a mass of fashionable hair on her head, that the squire, in his hurry, mistook for tow. "Plenty of time, sir," said a guard who was passing. 3 minutes to spare. Instead of saying he was obliged to the man for his civility, or relieved to find the tickets might still be had, the squire snatched out his old watch and began abusing the railway clocks for being slow. Had Todd been there, he would have told him to his face that the watch was fast, braving all retort, for the squire believed in his watch as he did in himself, and would rather have been told that he could go wrong than that the watch could. But there was only me, and I wouldn't have said it for anything. "Keep 2 back seats there, Johnny," said the squire. I put my coat on the corner furthest from the door, and the rug on the one next to it, and followed him into the station. When the squire was late in starting, he was apt to get into the greatest flurry conceivable, and the first thing I saw was himself blocking up the ticket place and undoing his pocketbook with nervous fingers. He had some loose gold about him, silver too, but the pocketbook came to his hand first, so he pulled it out. These flurried moments of the squire's amused Todd beyond everything. He was so cool himself. "Can you change this?" said the squire, drawing out one from a roll of £5 notes. "No, I can't," was the answer, in the surly tones put on by ticket clerks. How the squire crumpled up the note again, and searched in his breeches pocket for gold, and came away with the 2 tickets and the change, I'm sure he never knew. A crowd had gathered round, wanting to take their tickets in turn, and knowing that he was keeping them flurried him all the more. He stood at the back a moment, put the roll of notes into his case, fastened it and returned it to the breast of his overcoat, sent the change down into another pocket without counting it, and went out with the tickets in hand. Not to the carriage, but to stare at the big clock in front. "Don't you see, Johnny? Exactly 4 minutes and a half difference," he cried, holding out his watch to me. "It is a strange thing they can't keep these railway clocks in order. My watch keeps good time, sir, and mine is with the railway. I think it is right." "Hold your tongue, Johnny. How dare you? Right? You send your watch to be regulated the first opportunity, sir. Don't you get into the habit of being too late or too early. When we finally went to the carriage, there were some people in it, but our seats were left for us. Squire Toddley sat down by the further door and settled himself in his coats and his things comfortably, which he had been too flurried to do before. Cool as a cucumber was he. Now the bustle was over. Cool as Todd could have been. At the other door, with his face to the engine, sat a dark, gentlemanlike man of 40, who had made room for us to pass as we got in. He had a large signet ring on one hand and a lavender glove on the other. The other 3 seats opposite to us were vacant. Next to me sat a little man with a fresh color and gold spectacles, who was already reading. And beyond him, in the corner, face to face with the dark man, was a lunatic. That's to mention him politely. Of all the restless, fidgety, worrying, hot-tempered passengers that ever put themselves into a carriage to travel with people in their senses, he was the worst. In 15 moments he had made as many darts, now after his hat box and things above his head, now calling the guard and the porters to ask senseless questions about his luggage, now treading on our toes and trying the corner seat opposite the squire, and then darting back to his own. He wore a wig of a decided green tinge, the effect of keeping, perhaps, and his skin was dry and shriveled as an Egyptian mummy's. A servant, in undress livery, came to the door and touched his hat, which had a cockade on it, as he spoke to the dark man. "Your ticket, my lord. Lords are not traveled with every day," and some of us looked up. The gentleman took the ticket from the man's hand and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. "You can give me a newspaper, Wilkins. The Times, if it is to be had." "Yes, my lord." "Yes, there's room here, ma'am," interrupted the guard, sending the door back for a lady who stood at it. "Make haste, please." The lady who stepped in was the same the squire had bolted against. She sat down in the seat opposite me and looked at every one of us by turns. There was a sort of violet bloom on her face and some soft white powder, seen plain enough through her veil. She took the longest gaze at the dark gentleman, bending a little forward to do it, for, as he was in a line with her, and also had his head turned from her, her curiosity could only catch a view of his side face. Mrs. Toddley might have said she had not put on her company manners. In the midst of this, the manservant came back again. "The Times is not here yet, my lord. They are expecting the papers in by the next down train." "Never mind, then. You can get me one at the next station, Wilkins." "Very well, my lord." Wilkins must certainly have had to scramble for his carriage, for we started before he had well left the door. It was not an express train, and we should have to stop at several stations. Where the squire and I had been staying does not matter. It has nothing to do with what I have to tell. It was a long way from our own home, and that's saying enough. "Would you mind changing seats with me, sir?" I looked up to find the lady's face close to mine. She had spoken in a half-whisper. The squire, who carried his old-fashioned notions of politeness with him when he went traveling, at once got up to offer her the corner. But she declined it, saying she was subject to face-ache and did not care to be next the window. So she took my seat, and I sat down on the one opposite Mr. Toddley. "Which of the peers is that?" I heard her ask him in a loud whisper, as the lord put his head out at his window. "Don't know at all, ma'am," said the squire. "Don't know many of the peers myself, except those of my own county, Littleton and Beecham, and, of all snarling barks, the worst was given that moment in the squire's face, suddenly ending the list. The little dog, an ugly, hairy, vile-tempered Scotch terrier, had been kept concealed under the lady's jacket, and now struggled itself free. The squire's look of consternation was good. He had not known any animal was there. "Be quiet, Wasp. How dare you bark at the gentleman? He will not bite, sir." "Who is a dog in the carriage?" shrieked the lunatic, starting up in a passion. "Dogs don't travel with passengers. Here, guard, guard!" To call out for the guard when a train is going at full speed is generally useless. The lunatic had to sit down again, and the lady defied him, so to say, coolly avowing that she had hidden the dog from the guard on purpose, staring him in the face while she said it. After this there was a lull, and we went speeding along, the lady talking now and again to the squire. She seemed to want to grow confidential with him, but the squire did not seem to care for it, though he was quite civil. She held the dog huddled up in her lap, so that nothing but his head peeped out. "Hello! How dare they be so negligent? There's no lamp in this carriage." It was the lunatic again, and we all looked at the lamp. It had no light in it, but that it had when we first reached the carriage was certain. For as the squire went stumbling in, his head nearly touched the lamp, and I had noticed the flame. It seems the squire had also. They must have put it out while we were getting our tickets, he said. I'll know the reason why when we stop, cried the lunatic fiercely. After passing the next station, we dashed into the long tunnel. The idea of going through it in pitch darkness. It would not be safe, especially with a dog in the carriage, spoke the Lord in a chaffing kind of tone, but with a good-natured smile. We will have the lamp lighted, however. As if to reward him for interfering, the dog barked up loudly and tried to make a spring at him, upon which the lady smothered the animal up, head and all. Another minute or two, and the train began to slacken speed. It was only an insignificant station, one not likely to be halted at for above a minute. The lunatic twisted his body out of the window and shouted for the guard long before we were at a standstill. "Allow me to manage this," said the Lord, quietly putting him down. "They know me on the line. Wilkins!" The man came rushing up at the call. He must have been out already, though we were not quite at a standstill yet. "Is it for the Times, my lord?" "I am going for it. Never mind the Times. This lamp is not lighted, Wilkins. See the guard, and get it done, at once, and ask him what the mischief he means by his carelessness," roared out the lunatic after Wilkins, who went flying off, sending us on our road without a light, and that dangerous tunnel close at hand. The authority laid upon the words, "get it done," seemed an earnest that the speaker was accustomed to be obeyed, and would be this time. For once the lunatic sat quiet, watching the lamp, and for the light that was to be dropped into it from the top. And so did I, and so did the lady. We were all deceived, however, and the train went puffing on. The lunatic shrieked. The Lord put his head out of the carriage and shouted for Wilkins. No good. Shouting after a train is off never is much good. The Lord sat down on his seat again, an angry frown crossing his face, and the lunatic got up and danced with rage. "I do not know where the blame lies," observed the Lord. "Not with my servant, I think. He is attentive and has been with me some years. I'll know where it lies," retorted the lunatic. "I'm a director on the line, though I don't often travel on it. This is management. This is a few minutes more, and we shall be in the dark tunnel. Of course it would have been satisfactory to have a light, but it is not of so much consequence," said the nobleman, wishing to soothe him. "There's no danger in the dark." "No danger. No danger, sir. I think there is danger. Who's to know that dog won't spring out and bite us? Who's to know there won't be an accident in the tunnel? A light is a protection against having our pockets picked, if it's a protection against nothing else. I fancy our pockets are pretty safe today," said the Lord, glancing round at us with a good-natured smile, as much as to say that none of us looked like thieves. "And I certainly trust we shall get through the tunnel safely. And I'll take care the dog does not bite you in the dark," spoke up the lady, pushing her head forward to give the lunatic a nod or two that you'd hardly have matched for defying impudence. "You'll be good, won't you, Wasp? But I should like the lamp lighted myself. You will perhaps be so kind, my lord, as to see that there's no mistake made about it at the next station." He slightly raised his hat to her and bowed in answer, but did not speak. The lunatic buttoned up his coat with fingers that were either nervous or angry, and then disturbed the little gentleman next him, who had read his big book throughout the whole commotion without once lifting his eyes, by hunting everywhere for his pocket handkerchief. "Here's the tunnel," he cried out resentfully, as we dashed with a shriek in a pitch darkness. It was all very well for her to say she would take care of the dog, but the first thing the young beast did was to make a spring at me, and then at the squire, barking and yelping frightfully. The squire pushed it away in a commotion. Though well accustomed to dogs, he always fought shy of strange ones. The lady chattered and laughed, and did not seem to try to get hold of him, but we couldn't see, you know. The squire hissed at him. The dog snarled and growled. Altogether there was noise enough to deafen anything but a tunnel. "Pitch him out at the window," cried the lunatic. "Pitch yourself out," answered the lady. And whether she propelled the dog, or whether he went of his own accord, the beast sprang to the other end of the carriage, and was seized upon by the nobleman. "I think, madam, you had better put him under your mantle and keep him there," said he, bringing the dog back to her and speaking quite civilly, but in the same tone of authority he had used to his servant about the lamp. I have not the slightest objection to dogs myself, but many people have, and it is not altogether pleasant to have them loose in a railway carriage. I beg your pardon. I cannot see. Is this your hand? It was her hand, I suppose, for the dog was left with her, and he went back to his seat again. When we emerged out of the tunnel into daylight, the lunatic's face was blue. Ma'am, if that miserable brute had laid hold of me by so much as the corner of my great-coat tail, I'd have had the law of you. It is perfectly monstrous that anyone, putting themselves into a first-class carriage, should attempt to outrage railway laws and upset the comfort of travelers with impunity. I shall complain to the guard. He does not bite, sir. He never bites, she answered softly, as if sorry for the escapade and wishing to conciliate him. The poor little bijou is frightened at darkness and leaped from my arms unawares. There! I'll promise that you shall neither see nor hear him again. She had tucked the dog so completely out of sight that no one could have suspected one was there, just as it had been on first entering. The train was drawn up to the next station. When it stopped, the servant came and opened the carriage door for his master to get out. Did you understand me, Wilkins, when I told you to get this lamp lighted? My lord, I'm very sorry. I understood your lordship perfectly, but I couldn't see the guard, answered Wilkins. I caught sight of him running up to his van door at the last moment, but the train began to move off, and I had to jump in myself, or else be left behind. The guard passed as he was explaining this, and the nobleman drew his attention to the lamp, curtly ordering him to light it instantly. Lifting his hat to us by way of farewell, he disappeared, and the lunatic began upon the guard as if he were commencing a lecture to a deaf audience. The guard seemed not to hear it, so lost was he in astonishment at there being no light. Why, what can have doubted it? He cried aloud, staring up at the lamp. And the squire smiled at the familiar word, so common in our ears at home, and had a great mind to ask the guard where he came from. I lighted all these here lamps myself before we started, and I see 'em all burning, said he. There was no mistaking the home accent now, and the squire looked down the carriage with a beaming face. You are from Worcestershire, my man. From Worcester itself, sir. Leastways from St. John's, which is the same thing. Whether you are from Worcester, or whether you are from Jericho, I'll let you know that you can't put empty lamps into first-class carriages on this line without being made to answer for it, roared the lunatic. What's your name? I'm a director. My name is Thomas Brooks, sir, replied the man, respectfully touching his cap. But I declare to you, sir, that I've told the truth in saying the lamps were all right when we started. How this one can have got doubted, I can't think. There's not a guard on the line, sir, more particular in seeing to the lamps than I am. Well, light it now. Don't waste time excusing yourself, growled the lunatic. But he said nothing about the dog, which was surprising. In a twinkling the lamp was lighted, and we were off again. The lady and her dog were quiet now. He was out of sight. She leaned back to go to sleep. The squire lodged his head against the curtain and shut his eyes to do the same. The little man, as before, never looked off his book, and the lunatic frantically shifted himself every 2 minutes between his own seat and that of the opposite corner. There were no more tunnels, and we went smoothly on to the next station. 5 minutes allowed there. The little man, putting his book in his pocket, took down a black leather bag from above his head and got out. The lady, her dog hidden still, prepared to follow him, wishing the squire and me, and even the lunatic with a forgiving smile, a polite good morning. I had moved to that end, and was watching the lady's wonderful back hair as she stepped out, when all in a moment the squire sprang up with a shout, and jumping out nearly upon her, called out that he had been robbed. She dropped the dog, and I thought he must have caught the lunatic's disorder and become frantic. It is of no use attempting to describe exactly what followed. The lady, snatching up her dog, shrieked out that perhaps she had been robbed too. She laid hold of the squire's arm and went with him into the station-master's room. And there we were, us three, and the guard, and the station-master, and the lunatic, who had come pouncing out too at the squire's cry. The man in spectacles had disappeared for good. The squire's pocketbook was gone. He gave his name and address at once to the station-master, and the guard's face lighted with intelligence when he heard it, for he knew Squire Toddley by reputation. The pocketbook had been safe just before we entered the tunnel. The squire was certain of that, having felt it. He had sat in the carriage with his coat unbuttoned, rather thrown back, and nothing could have been easier than for a clever thief to draw it out, under cover of the darkness. "I had £50 in it," he said, £50 in £5 notes, and some memoranda besides. £50, cried the lady quickly. "And you could travel with all that about you, and not button up your coat. You ought to be rich. Have you been in the habit of meeting thieves, madam, when traveling?" suddenly demanded the lunatic, turning upon her without warning, his coat whirling about on all sides with the rapidity of his movements. "No, sir, I have not," she answered in indignant tones. "Have you?" "I have not, madam. But, then, you perceive I see no risk in traveling with a coat unbuttoned, although it may have banknotes in the pockets." She made no reply, was too much occupied in turning out her own pockets and purse to ascertain that they had not been rifled. Reassured on the point, she sat down on a low box against the wall, nursing her dog, which had begun its snarling again. "It must have been taken from me in the dark as we went through the tunnel," affirmed the squire to the room in general, and perhaps the station master in particular. "I am a magistrate and have some experience in these things. I sat completely off my guard, a prey for anybody, my hands stretched out before me, grappling with that dog that seemed, why, goodness me, yes he did, now that I think of it, that seemed to be held about 15 inches off my nose on purpose to attack me. That's when the thing must have been done. But now, which of them could it have been?" He meant which of the passengers. As he looked hard at us in rotation, especially at the guard and station master, who had not been in the carriage, the lady gave a shriek and threw the dog into the middle of the room. "I see it all," she said, faintly. "He has a habit of snatching at things with his mouth. He must have snatched the case out of your pocket, sir, and dropped it from the window. You will find it in the tunnel." "Who has?" asked the lunatic, while the squire stared in wonder. "My poor little wasp. Ah, villain, beast, it is he that has done all this mischief." "He might have taken the pocketbook," I said, thinking it time to speak, "but he could not have dropped it out, for I put the window up as we went into the tunnel." It seemed a nonplus for her, and her face fell again. "There was the other window," she said in a minute. "He might have dropped it there. I heard his bark quite close to it." "I pulled up that window, madam," said the lunatic. "If the dog did take it out of the pocket, it may be in the carriage now." The guard rushed out to search it. The squire followed, but the station master remained where he was and closed the door after them. A thought came over me that he was stopping to keep the two passengers in view. No, the pocketbook could not be found in the carriage. As they came back, the squire was asking the guard if he knew who the nobleman was who had got out at the last station with his servant. But the guard did not know. He said they knew him on the line. "Very likely, sir. I have not been on this line above a month or two." "Well, this is an unpleasant affair," said the lunatic impatiently. "And the question is, what's to be done? It appears pretty evident that your pocketbook was taken in the carriage, sir. Of the 4 passengers, I suppose the one who left us at the last station must be held exempt from suspicion, being a nobleman. Another got out here and has disappeared. The other 2 are present. I propose that we should both be searched." "I'm sure I am quite willing," said the lady, and she got up at once. I think the squire was about to disclaim any wish so to act, but the lunatic was resolute, and the station master agreed with him. There was no time to be lost, for the train was ready to start again, her time being up, and the lunatic was turned out. The lady went into another room with 2 women, called by the station master, and she was turned out. Neither of them had the pocketbook. "Here's my card, sir," said the lunatic, handing one to Mr. Toddley. "You know my name, I dare say. If I can be of any future assistance to you in this matter, you may command me." "Bless my heart," cried the squire, as he read the name on the card. "How could you allow yourself to be searched, sir?" "Because in such a case as this, I think it only right and fair that every one who has the misfortune to be mixed up in it should be searched," replied the lunatic as they went out together. "It is a satisfaction to both parties. Unless you offer to search me, you could not have offered to search that woman, and I suspected her." "Suspected her?" cried the squire, opening his eyes. "If I didn't suspect, I doubted. Why on earth did she cause her dog to make all that row the moment we got into the tunnel?" It must have been done then. I should not be startled out of my senses if I heard that silent man by my side and hers was in league with her. The squire stood in a kind of amazement, trying to recall what he could of the little man in spectacles, and see if things would fit into one another. "Don't you like her look?" he asked suddenly. "No, I don't," said the lunatic, turning himself about. "I have a prejudice against painted women. They put me in mind of Jezebel. Look at her hair. It's awful." He went out in a whirlwind and took his seat in the carriage, not a moment before it puffed off. "Is he a lunatic?" I whispered to the squire. "He a lunatic?" he roared. "You must be a lunatic for asking it, Johnny." "Why, that's—" Instead of saying any more, he showed me the card, and the name nearly took my breath away. He is a well-known London man of science, talent, and position, and of worldwide fame. Well, I thought him nothing better than an escaped maniac. "Did you?" said the squire. "Perhaps he returned the compliment on you, sir. But now, Johnny, who has got my pocketbook, as if it was any use asking me?" As we turned back to the station master's room, the lady came into it, evidently resenting the search, although she had seemed to acquiesce in it so readily. They were rude, those women. It is the first time I ever had the misfortune to travel with men who carry pocketbooks to lose them, and I hope it will be the last, she pursued, in scornful passion, meant for the squire. "One generally meets with gentlemen in a first-class carriage." The emphasis came out with a shriek, and it told on him. Now that she was proved innocent, he was as vexed as she for having listened to the advice of the scientific man. But I can't help calling him a lunatic still. The squire's apologies might have disarmed a cross-grained hyena, and she came round with a smile. "If anyone has got the pocketbook," she said as she stroked her dog's ears, "it must be that silent man with the gold spectacles. There was no one else, sir, who could have reached you without getting up to do it. And I declare on my honor that when that commotion first arose through my poor little dog, I felt for a moment something like a man's arm stretched across me. It could only have been his. I hope you have the numbers of the notes." "But I have not," said the squire. The room was being invaded by this time. Two stray passengers, a friend of the station master's, and the porter who took the tickets, had crept in. All thought the lady's opinion must be correct, and said the spectacled man had got clear off with the pocketbook. There was no one else to pitch upon. A nobleman traveling with his servant would not be likely to commit a robbery. The lunatic was really the man his card represented him to be, for the station master's friend had seen and recognized him, and the lady was proved innocent by search. Was it the squire in a passion? That close reading of his was all a blind, he said in sudden conviction. He kept his face down that we should not know him in future. He never looked at one of us. He never said a word. I shall go and find him. Away went the squire, as fast as he could hurry, but came back in a moment to know which was the way out, and where it led to. There was quite a small crowd of us by this time. Some fields lay beyond the station at the back, and a boy affirmed that he had seen a little gentleman in spectacles, with a black bag in his hand, making over the first stile. "Now look here, boy," said the squire. "If you catch that same man, I'll give you 5 shillings. Todd could not have flown faster than the boy did. He took the stile at a leap, and the squire tumbled over it after him. Some boys and men joined in the chase, and a cow, grazing in the field, trotted after us and brought up the rear. Such a shout from the boy! It came from behind the opposite hedge of the long field. I was over the gate first. The squire came next. On the hedge of the dry ditch sat the passenger, his legs dangling, his neck imprisoned in the boy's arms. I knew him at once. His hat and gold spectacles had fallen off in the scuffle. The black bag was wide open and had a tall bunch of something green sticking up from it. Some tools lay on the ground. "Oh, you wicked hypocrite," spluttered the squire, not in the least knowing what he said in his passion. "Are you not ashamed to have played upon me such a vile trick? How dare you go about to commit robberies?" "I have not robbed you, at any rate," said the man, his voice trembling a little and his face pale, while the boy loosed the neck but pinioned one of the arms. "Not robbed me?" cried the squire. "Good heavens! Who do you suppose you have robbed, if not me? Here, Johnny lad, you are a witness. He says he has not robbed me. I did not know it was yours," said the man meekly. "Loose me, boy. I'll not attempt to run away. Hello! Here! What's to do?" roared a big fellow, swinging himself over the gate. Any tramp been trespassing? Anybody wanted to be took up? I'm the parish constable. If he had said he was the parish engine, ready to let loose buckets of water on the offender, he could not have been more welcome. The squire's face was rosy with satisfaction. Have you your handcuffs with you, my man? I've not got them, sir, but I fancy I'm big enough and strong enough to take him without something to spare, too. There's nothing like handcuffs for safety, said the squire, rather damped, for he believed in them as one of the country's institutions. Oh, you villain! Perhaps you can tie him with cords? The thief floundered out of the ditch and stood upon his feet. He did not look an ungentlemanly thief. Now you came to see and hear him, and his face, though scared, might have been thought an honest one. He picked up his hat and glasses, and held them in his hand while he spoke in tones of earnest remonstrance. Surely, sir, you would not have me taken up for this slight offense. I did not know I was doing wrong, and I doubt if the law would condemn me. I thought it was public property. Public property, cried the squire, turning red at the words. Of all the impudent, brazen-faced rascals that are cheating the gallows, you must be the worst. My banknotes public property. Your what, sir? My banknotes, you villain. How dare you repeat your insolent questions? But I don't know anything about your banknotes, sir, said the man meekly. I do not know what you mean. They stood facing each other, a sight for a picture. The squire with his hands under his coat, dancing a little in rage, his face crimson, the other quite still, holding his hat and gold spectacles, and looking at him in wonder. You don't know what I mean. When you confessed with your last breath that you had robbed me of my pocketbook, I confessed, I have not sought to conceal, that I have robbed the ground of this rare fern, said the man, handling carefully the green stuff in the black bag. I have not robbed you or anyone of anything else. The tone, simple, quiet, self-contained, threw the squire in amazement. He stood staring. Are you a fool? He asked. What do you suppose I have to do with your rubbishing ferns? Nay, I suppose you own them. That is, own the land. You led me to believe so, in saying I had robbed you. What I've lost is a pocketbook with 10 5-pound banknotes in it. I lost it in the train. It must have been taken as we came through the tunnel, and you sat next but one to me, reiterated the squire. The man put on his hat and glasses. I am a geologist and botanist, sir. I came here after this plant today, having seen it yesterday, but then I had not my tools with me. I don't know anything about the pocketbook and banknotes. So that was another mistake, for the botanist turned out of his pockets a heap of letters directed to him, and a big book he had been reading in the train, a treatise on botany, to prove who he was. And, as if to leave no loophole for doubt, one stepped up who knew him, and assured the squire there was not a more learned man in his line, no, nor one more respected in the 3 kingdoms. The squire shook him by the hand in apologizing, and told him we had some valuable ferns near Dyke Manor, if he would come and see them. Like patience on a monument, when we got back, sat the lady, waiting to see the prisoner brought in. Her face would have made a picture, too, when she heard the upshot and saw the hot squire and the gold spectacles walking side by side in friendly talk. I think still he must have got it, she said sharply. No, madam, answered the squire. Whoever may have taken it, it was not he. Then there's only one man, and that is he whom you have let go on in the train, she returned decisively. I thought his fidgety movements were not put on for nothing. He had secured the pocketbook somewhere, and then made a show of offering to be searched. Ah! And the squire veered round again at this suggestion, and began to suspect he had been doubly cheated. First out of his money, next out of his suspicions. One only thing in the whole bother seemed clear, and that was that the notes and case had gone for good. As, in point of fact, they had. We were on the chain pier at Brighton, Todd and I. It was about 8 or 9 months after. I had put my arms on the rails at the end, looking at a pleasure party sailing by. Todd, next to me, was bewailing his ill fortune in not possessing a yacht and opportunities of cruising in it. I tell you no, I don't want to be made seasick. The words came from someone behind us. It seemed almost as though they were spoken in reference to Todd's wish for a yacht. But it was not that made me turn round sharply. It was the sound of the voice, for I thought I recognized it. Yes, there she was, the lady who had been with us in the carriage that day. The dog was not with her now, but her hair was more amazing than ever. She did not see me. As I turned, she turned and began to walk slowly back, arm in arm with a gentleman. And to see him, that is, to see them together, made me open my eyes, for it was the Lord who had traveled with us. "Look, Todd," I said, and told him in a word who they were. "What the deuce do they know of each other?" cried Todd with a frown, for he felt angry every time the thing was referred to. Not for the loss of the money, but for what he called the stupidity of us all, saying always had he been there, he should have detected the thief at once. I sauntered after them. Why I wanted to learn which of the lords he was, I can't tell, for lords are numerous enough, but I had had a curiosity upon the point ever since. They encountered some people and were standing to speak to them. 3 ladies, and a fellow in a black glazed hat with a piece of green ribbon round it. I was trying to induce my wife to take a sail, the Lord was saying, but she won't. She is not a very good sailor, unless the sea has its best behavior on. "Will you go tomorrow, Mrs. Mowbray?" asked the man in the glazed hat, who spoke and looked like a gentleman. "I will promise you perfect calmness. I am weather-wise, and can assure you this little wind will have gone down before night, leaving us without a breath of air. I will go, on condition that your assurance proves correct." "All right. You of course will come, Mowbray?" The Lord nodded. "Very happy. When do you leave Brighton, Mr. Mowbray?" asked one of the ladies. "I don't know exactly. Not for some days." "A muff as usual, Johnny," whispered Todd. "That man is no lord. He is a Mr. Mowbray, but Todd, he is the lord. It is the one who traveled with us. There's no mistake about that. Lords can't put off their titles as parsons can. Do you suppose his servant would have called him my lord if he had not been one? At least there is no mistake that these people are calling him Mr. Mowbray now." That was true. It was equally true that they were calling her Mrs. Mowbray. My ears had been as quick as Todd's, and I don't deny I was puzzled. They turned to come up the pier again with the people, and the lady saw me standing there with Todd. Saw me looking at her, too, and I think she did not relish it, for she took a step backward as one startled, and then stared me full in the face, as if asking who I might be. I lifted my hat. There was no response. In another moment she and her husband were walking quickly down the pier together, and the other party went on to the end quietly. A man in a tweed suit and brown hat drawn low over his eyes was standing with his arms folded, looking after the two with a queer smile upon his face. Todd marked it and spoke. "Do you happen to know that gentleman?" "Yes, I do," was the answer. "Is he a peer?" "On occasion." "On occasion," repeated Todd. "I have a reason for asking," he added. "Do not think me impertinent." "Been swindled out of anything?" asked the man, coolly. "My father was, some months ago. He lost a pocketbook with £50 in it in a railway carriage. Those people were both in it, but not then acquainted with each other." "Oh, weren't they?" said the man. "No, they were not. I put in, for I was there." "He was a lord then?" "Ah," said the man, "and had a servant in livery, no doubt, who came up my lording him unnecessarily every other minute. He is a member of the swell mob, one of the cleverest of the gentleman fraternity, and the one who acts as servant is another of them." "And the lady?" I asked. "She is a third. They have been working in concert for 2 or 3 years now, and will give us trouble yet before their career is stopped. But for being singularly clever, we should have had them long ago. And so they did not know each other in the train." "I dare say not." The man spoke with quiet authority. He was a detective come down from London to Brighton that morning. Whether for a private trip or on business, he did not say. I related to him what had passed in the train. "Aye," said he after listening. "They contrived to put the lamp out before starting. The lady took the pocketbook during the commotion she caused the dog to make, and the lord received it from her hand when he gave her back the dog. Cleverly done. He had it about him, young sir, when he got out at the next station. She waited to be searched and to throw the scent off. Very ingenious, but they'll be a little too much so some fine day." "Can't you take them up?" demanded Todd. "No, I will accuse them of it," he haughtily said, "if I meet them again on this pier." "Which you won't do today," interrupted the man. "I heard them say they were not going for some days." "Ah, but they have seen you now, and I think, I'm not quite sure, that he saw me. They'll be off by the next train." "Who are they?" asked Todd, pointing to the end of the pier. unsuspecting people whose acquaintance they have casually made here. Yes, an hour or two will see Brighton quit of the pair. And it was so. A train was starting within an hour, and Todd and I galloped to the station. There they were, in a first-class carriage, not apparently knowing each other, I verily believe, for he sat at one door, and she at the other, passengers dividing them. Lambs between two wolves, remarked Todd. I have a great mind to warn the people of the sort of company they are in. Would it be actionable, Johnny? The train moved off as he was speaking. And may I never write another word if I did not catch sight of the manservant and his cockade in the next carriage behind them,